series or teaching, I guess, in our series on Christianity's family tree. And so today we're going to be talking about the people called Methodist, which is our own branch of Christianity's family tree. So let's get started. Our key scripture today comes from 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 15. And it says this: Jehu departed from there and encountered Rehab's son Jehonadab. Jehu greeted him and asked, "Are you as committed to me as I am to you?" And Jehonadab responded, "Yes, I am." "If so," said Jehu, "then give me your hand." So Jehonadab put out his hand, and Jehu pulled him up into the chariot. Now, so we've kind of gone over a little bit of Methodist history, but we're going to go over just a little bit more here. If you'll remember, last week we talked about Pentecostalism, which is actually an offshoot of our Methodist tradition. And so, if you remember, they sprung off of us, but we, as Methodists, came to be as a part of the Anglican movement. And so Methodism really sought a middle way between the high church of the Anglican Church and the low church of the Puritans and the nonconformists of their time. It sought this way between pietism, which is the holiness movement, but also the Enlightenment that had come to Britain as a part of that tradition. And so Methodism really is this combining, this finding a middle way, even within the middle way of Anglicanism, of bringing together rational thought with a personal faith, and so kind of combining these two things. Now, we can't talk about Methodism without talking about its founder, John Wesley. And Wesley was an Anglican priest in the 1700s. He began as his career in ministry. He's the son of a priest, and I believe the grandson of kind of some nonconformist pastors. But he really began his journey to ministry at Oxford, and he started there kind of leading some of his fellow students in a sort of campus ministry. Imagine that. So Methodists were called that because Wesley and his followers tended toward more religious vigor, perhaps, than their counterparts in other places. So they were often talking to each other about their sins. They were often found worshiping and praying together, but they were also doing works of service in their communities, particularly helping folks learn to read, visiting prisons, taking seriously the gospel. And so Wesley really sought to hold in tension this need to have a really intentionally strong faith with a personal experience of God. Now again, John Wesley was an Anglican priest. He never meant to start any kind of other sort of denomination. That was not his intention. His intention was to revive the Anglican tradition. And so Methodism really began as a revival movement within the Anglican Church. And the followers of called Methodists, were meant to live by three simple rules. And you sometimes hear these rules preached about or taught about. But the first is to avoid doing what you know is wrong, to do all the good you can to everyone that you can, and then to pursue the spiritual disciplines of prayer and scripture reading, worship, and fasting, along with others. But to the people called Methodist, followers were often called through these sort of religious revival experiences. So it wasn't as if Wesley and his fellow preachers or fellow revivalists were going into churches and being able to preach and lead in that way. It was more akin to Billy Graham, perhaps, of this idea of field preaching. Billy Graham obviously is not Methodist, but he kind of had this same style of revival. And so Wesley would go into a town. He might preach from, a gravestone. He might preach in a field, and people would come from all over to hear his words, to hear those others like George Whitefield, some others who were preaching and leading in that way. And he was really trying to help people revitalize or revamp their own faith. And so he organized people once they had kind of had that moment of realizing their need for God. He would organize them into classes or bands, which were groups or meetings, and they would meet together, kind of like we do small groups now. And they were taught theological principles through John Wesley's brother Charles. And so Charles was a hymn writer, and normally what he would do is he would actually take contemporary songs, so songs that were sung, in other places like the pub. He would take those songs and he would make them into religious songs that taught about what it meant to live as a Christian. And so some of the songs that we know from Charles Wesley are Blessed Assurance, or Hark the Herald Angels Sing. I mean, Charles Wesley had some really popular songs that helped encourage people to truly understand their faith in a new way. Now, the hallmarks of Methodism are perhaps not the things that you might think about as being unique, especially if you grew up in the Methodist Church. But our denomination tends to be an ecumenical denomination, which means that we want to learn and work and support other Christian groups. I mean, we came out of a church that we never really, it wasn't like we fought with them. It was more that we had different ideas and goals. And so Methodism, since its very beginnings, has been ecumenical in nature, wanting to learn and work alongside other denominations, which is why we can have studies like this, why we can study other denominations and learn from them and grow because of them. John Wesley actually had a sermon called The Catholic Spirit. Catholic meaning universal, not necessarily Catholic meaning the Catholic Church, but meaning that universal church, universal spirit that we all have. And in it, he says, this famous quote, he says, "Though we may not think alike, may we not love alike." Again, that if your heart is as my heart, reach out your hand, right? Jehu says that in our scripture today of, if we may not get along, but we can help one another out, right? And so that is truly a hallmark of the Methodist faith. Now, another hallmark is, again, and this dates back to just the beginnings of our church, is this combination of intellect and faith. And so for Methodists, it really is, we don't want to walk into a room and feel like we aren't being hit in both the head and the heart, right? I think there are some places and some churches that tend to be intellectual in their faith, that tend to think about God but not experience God, and we as Methodists tend to want both and seek after both. And that's something that truly is a hallmark of being Methodist, right? So if you remember, when we talked about the Anglican Church, we talked about their three-legged stool approach, which sounded oddly familiar, right? They had scripture and reason and tradition that kind of upheld all of their beliefs. Well, Wesley added another leg to that stool, and it became the Wesleyan quadrilateral that we know. I mean, he really valued experience, right? That we not only think about God, that we not only read about God, but that we experience God's love for ourselves. And that was super important to Wesley because that was how he truly came to faith, even as a minister. When he went to the United States, went to Georgia, and was struggling with some, is this really what I'm called to do? Is this who I'm supposed to be? He came back and he had seen all of these people who had such a strong faith, and he really wanted that for himself, but he hadn't experienced it. And as he kept praying and thinking and reading about what that would mean, kept being very scared about his own spiritual journey, about him having his own assurance that God was real and that salvation was meant for him. He had what we call the Aldersgate experience, where he was reading Martin Luther, again, ecumenical. He was reading Martin Luther's Introduction to Romans and realized that Christ died for him, for him. And that experience of being overwhelmed with this assurance that, goodness, God is with me, is truly something that we as Methodists strive for, and something that it has been kind of brought into our religion and our faith in our denomination. Now, additionally, one of the hallmarks of Methodists is that we emphasize free will. And I say this because Wesley was very against the predestination teachings that were happening in his time. And so he very much stood up against those who were talking about chosen and elect. And so Wesley emphasized that we all have the ability to choose grace or to reject that grace. And we still hold that very firmly today. I think that's why we struggle quite a bit with some common American ideas and teachings of American Christianity are kind of rooted in this idea of predestination or of election, right, into the church. And as Methodists, we really reject that. And so this idea of being able to choose God's grace, that God is always reaching out for us, and it's our choice whether we accept that or reject that, is a hallmark of the Methodist Church. Now, along those same lines, grace doesn't stop when we choose that for ourselves. Grace continues, and so we hold together this idea that God's grace is available to us in all ways, in all fashions through our lives, that God is always reaching out to us and wanting us to do what we can. But there's also this idea of holiness, that we are called by our salvation, by our baptism, by our relationship with God, to go forth and do good in the world, right? So we recognize that salvation can't happen apart from God's grace, and yet it's through salvation that we're equipped to do good works. So we recognize the need, and the way Wesley talked about this was through sanctification, right? We talk about, there are three phases of grace. There's prevenient grace when you don't even know that you need it. There's justifying grace when you choose and accept that. But that grace continues in sanctification, that we're always moving toward being perfected in love. And Christian perfection is certainly a true Wesleyan idea. And so as we think about the hallmarks of Methodism, that idea of sanctification, that we're always going forward to do more, not to work toward our salvation, but to work toward something else, to work toward perfection in love, is truly something that we value highly as Methodists. I have really enjoyed doing this study. I really appreciate learning more about all of our different denominations and about all of the ways that we are similar and yet different. And I especially appreciate us as Methodists really digging into the idea of ecumenism, of being able to talk about other faiths, being able to talk about other denominations. And so I know I'm a Methodist because of grace. I really appreciate that we put such a high emphasis on God's grace, on recognizing that God's grace is available to everyone, and that it's there even when we don't know that we need it yet. And that's why we have open communion. That's why we baptize infants, and that kind of filters through the entirety of our religious tradition. And so I hope this week, as you kind of think about this, that you'll reflect too on what is it about this denomination, about the denomination that you're a part of. What is it about that truly speaks to you, that helps you understand your walk with God? And so starting next week, we'll be digging into something a little different. We'll be talking about world religions, and so I hope that you will join us for that as well. A little different than just ecumenical thinking, but truly interfaith thinking And I'm excited to kind of dig into that with you all. So I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope that you're staying safe, and may God continue to bless you on this journey of faith.